The numerous local songs are of two varieties: the Old English tragic ballads of the 19th century that tell of ships, famous local disasters, and the loss of loved ones, and the shorter songs of more recent vintage, which describe local happenings in outport life, usually of a humorous nature. The Irish influence is more noticeable in the older songs, which are usually in the Dorian or Mixolydian mode, and seem to fit the ternary time signature best. The newer local songs show a variety of influences: Old Irish, Comic Irish, and, lately, Commercial Cowboy. The local song tradition is still flourishing, and each year brings a new crop of ballads about the sea and the ships, and about life in the outports, the new industrial towns, and the lumber and road gang camps. Many of these local songs are equal to anything I have heard surviving from the old world, and occasionally they possess a tragic insight or sardonic humor that is unique in English language folk song. Hello, this is Ian, and today we're talking about Anna Guigné's Folksong Collections and Folklore Research in Newfoundland, 1920 to 1959. This is a chapter from a longer work, Anna's book Folksongs and Folk Revival, which is the subtitle of which, we'll explain most of it, The Cultural Politics of Kenneth Peacock's Songs of the Newfoundland Outports. So this chapter is laying the groundwork for what Peacock was walking into when he started his collection. And we are actually going to also be talking about Peacock's, the first publication from Peacock's fieldwork that later on became Songs of the Newfoundland Outports, an article from the Journal of American Folklore, called 9 Songs from Newfoundland. So what this chapter is doing is basically setting the table about how folk song had been collected in Canada, and particularly the precursors to Peacock's collections he drew from, collections that his sponsors had drawn from in terms of even being motivated to turn to Newfoundland as a potential field site. And he focuses on 3, basically because there were only 3. And the first is Elizabeth Bristol Greenleaf. She was an American who first went to Newfoundland during the Grenfell missions. Sir Wilfrid Grenfell was a Boston-based doctor who set up missions, basically volunteer, almost like Médecins Sans Frontières type hospitals along the west coast of Newfoundland and then up to the tip of up to the coast of Labrador. Missions by any other stretch of the imagination. This was an underserviced part of the world, an underserviced part of North America, and not only was his primary objective to bring medical attention there, but also a sort of social. He had a social cause, and to potentially plant the seeds of some kind of economic independence as well, because obviously health is a critical facet, but the well-being of a community is more so than simply the well-being of the physical bodies of that community. Grenfell missions were also responsible for some of the introduction of craft industry in Newfoundland, and the discovery of markets for traditional Newfoundland crafts, particularly rug hooking. And one of the things that the Grenfell missions did, and which was run primarily by volunteers, almost like a pseudo Peace Corps situation. They would go and university educated young people of the American Northeast would go and try and introduce, I don't know how you would phrase it, because I want to say things like Western culture, but basically bring in a more sustained system, or at least the opportunity for workshops and education and the development of some kind of social networks. And the Grenfell missions, they saw these hooked rugs and saw these other crafts, and there was a burgeoning market for what might have been called primitive craft work at the time in the United States, and set up these little craft cottages, basically, where these were made not for things started to be made not simply for local consumption and therefore informed by local aesthetics, but also for export and the expectation of these things, not simply as practical objects, but as crafts, which reframes the making into something. But we're not talking about, there's actually a strange overlap, although we're not talking about crafts right now. Greenleaf, sorry, Elizabeth Bristol Greenleaf, she was Elizabeth Bristol at the time, went up there in 1920 and was charmed by the song. She had encountered people like John Lomax, and who had given a lecture at her university. She went to Vassar, and there was this, not simply, she was aware of, she wasn't trained in, but she was aware of the academic interest in folk song. That he'd already been seeing. The American Folklore Society had been around for 35 or 40 years at this point. So when she returned, and she started making notes of these songs, and when she returned, she told people who could do something. She told the president of Vassar, and she told some of her old professors, and they encouraged her to go back the next year, because she went back and volunteered for the missions again the next summer. And she started collecting some more. And then she basically sat on it. She got married, she had a son. And but people were still interested in her work. And so she went up to Newfoundland again in the late 1920s. And this time she was accompanied by Grace Mansfield, who had more musical training. Greenleaf actually had a fair amount of sort of amateur musical training, enough that she was able to take notes, enough that she was able to make observations, detailed observations about music, about the tunes and keys and so on. But she wasn't a trained musician or trained a musicologist by any stretch. So, but she was able to therefore guide Grace and prepare Grace for what could be expected in the collections. And one of the things that makes and sort of extraordinary backup for or background to Greenleaf is that she was very Catholic in her collecting tastes. She was as interested in local song as she was interested in child ballads and old-timey songs. She was not cutting down what would get collected. And even though it eventually became a publication, it had a limited print run, but it was very influential and sort of very praised locally and throughout North America as this important moment in taking Newfoundland folk song seriously, especially with the inclusion of some musical transcriptions by Mansfield, and it was pushing this idea that was already present in the general discussion in folklore, but hadn't necessarily percolated into these popular understanding of folk song, and hadn't necessarily percolated much into the Academy on a sustained level. The idea that there was something interesting happening with these pieces themselves, that they were interesting creations of this group of people, as opposed to this group of people were merely hanging on to the creativity that was actually of generations past, and that these people are just the vehicle through which the genuine creativity of some ancient past enters into our sphere. At about the same time, there was Maud Karpeles. And Maud Karpeles was trained by Cecil Sharp, and she was actually Cecil Sharp's research assistant. Cecil Sharp was an Englishman, and part of the English Song and Dance, Traditional Song and Dance Society, Folk Song and Dance. I will probably put a little chiron to give the exact name of the association that he basically started. And he was interested in things like child ballads. If you don't know what a child ballad is, Francis James Child, who was, among other things, he was the first person to have a chair in English at Harvard University, because until the late 19th century, English wasn't something that one would study at university, because it was like a parochial language. And then it's like, no, this is its own creativity, and it had obviously developed a critical apparatus, but it was now a thing. And his lifetime work was about ballads. particularly of the border between Scotland and England. And a ballad is a long-form lyric narrative. It is in verse. It is typically sung, and almost exclusively sung, although, interestingly enough, he wasn't that interested in the tunes. And one of the things that he did was he collected, I think the number's 305, 310 ballads that he arranged, and he ascribed numbers to. And then for each one, he would usually have variants. So there'd be 206. I don't know what ballad 206 is, but that's a number between 1 and 305, isn't it? 206, A, B, C, D, E, where A was what he considered the best, the most original, the most important, and those three kind of are fuzzy and overlapping criteria. And then with B, C, D, E, they would basically be arranged per his aesthetics and his interpretation as lesser, but still increasingly lesser, but still of interest variations from A. And in a way, his multi-volume work, the English and Scottish Popular Ballads, which is a 6-volume work, it more or less, to a certain extent, it comprised the canon of English folk song, English language folk song for a while. And anything that wasn't in that collection almost wasn't real folk song, and anything that was. And when I say he collected them, he more or less got them from extant manuscripts. And occasionally he would collect, and his collection was done via other collectors. He would occasionally get stuff that was collected in the field. But he was very much of the, I guess this person does an interesting one. So a reluctant ethnographer at best. And you know, more or less he did it all from his study in Harvard, in Boston, Cambridge. Cecil Sharp was very much invested in that English nationalist form, and he went down and was interested in other enclaves of early English language immigration to North America, where there might be these isolated people where the songs were still to be found. He went to Appalachia, and he found a number, and again, this is a group that had process of English language immigration, and that these songs were still in place. Some of the things that had been collected in the 1870s and the 1880s by Francis James Child were still in active circulation, and had been in active circulation since, you know, the 17th and 18th centuries, and were still around in Appalachia at the end of the 19th and the turn of the 20th century. And he had great plans to go to Newfoundland, another place with early English immigration, and the population had been fairly removed from other populations. You know, sort of isolated. I mean, literally isola, but you know, isolated, not removed. I mean, all these places were engaged in, you know, post-contact trade and exchanges and so on, but you know, you can still say generally isolated populations and go there. Sharp died, and Carpelli's continued his work and followed through, and with great fanfare sort of arrived as, you know, I am the student of Cecil Sharp, and look at me and dig me, and showed up in St. John and did some fairly impressive work. But she did it with that same idea that she was interested in the old, and she was interested in the original, or she was interested in the stuff that came over from England, that everything that was sort of locally composed, or worse, that was evidence of broadside or evidence of popular tradition or locally composed, no sir for her. So she was very conservative in her collection. Because it didn't fit in with her agenda, it didn't fit in with her definition of what comprised both the folk and also the object proper of folk song collecting. And that, no, it's only this stuff that has remarkable depth of precedent that we should call folk song. And she put out a collection that was also incredibly popular, and she was used more than Greenleaf and Mansfield in local vernacular St. John's, particularly St. John's, but local vernacular Newfoundland publications that were now taking Newfoundland traditions and packaging them and creating things like the Gerald S. Doyle Songsters, which became very much disentangleable from the Newfoundland folk song tradition. These are basically popular books with ads sold in them and everything, and they were lyrics and sometimes transcriptions on the great Newfoundland folk songs, and then they would enter into people's living rooms and so on, and that lovely reciprocity between folk and popular culture continues in that way. And they were drawing in some of the editions on Carpelli's. But what gets collected, and this is one of Anna's points, and one of the points that we should be taking away from this as sort of lessons learned. One of the things is that folklorists come in from somewhere else historically, and so far, with a couple of very minor exceptions, so far what gets collected in Atlantic Canada is done by non-Atlantic Canadians, for the most part, and again, with some exceptions. And they come in and they have a purpose. They have a purpose that is either theirs, or they have a purpose that is their sponsors, their funding agencies, and so on. And then they collect according to that. And not only do they collect, they then edit, whether it is changing the items that they collect, which happens on occasion in terms of cleaning up the language or reordering of verses or whatever, or retelling in the case of narratives. It's doubly so since they didn't have much in the way of recording devices, and we'll get to that point in a second. And then what they present, what is actually made available to the public, is going to be already a process of selection. What should and shouldn't be included in a general discussion as far as they or their sponsors are concerned. And so the very questions that they ask are going to determine what ultimately gets represented, and then not simply represented, but enshrined through something that we typically pay deference to, which is a publication. So whether it's Greenleaf and Mansfield's publication, whether it is Carpelli's publication, they become these books that the locals themselves start turning towards as somehow more authoritative than their own sense of their tradition. Because on one hand, people are doing a good thing. People are taking this creativity and they are, as it were, registering it. They're like snapshotting it. They are making sure that at least what they have at their disposal doesn't disappear. But by virtue of taking one ephemeral moment out of thousands of ephemeral moments and turning that into text and giving that the imprimatur of the state or of the academy, all of a sudden these become privileged and they become, oh, well, this is actually the way it goes. And so we always want to be careful. And then, what is and isn't folk song? What is and what does and doesn't qualify as a piece of traditional verse by whatever means you wish to call something traditional? And those are the questions that are being addressed. Then comes MacEdward Leach. So you had Greenleaf, who was basically she was an educated, but we can say amateur, with all due deference and all due respect to the concept of the amateur. She had, it was her interest. She brought great intelligence to it. She brought a great understanding. She was building on these social networks that she had earned by virtue of the work that she'd done in the Grenfell missions. And, it was sort of a calling of hers to go back and do this collecting, and she was able to do it in a very effective way. And it's really when you can call her an amateur in a dismissive way, and people did for a generation or two. But, it's a truly excellent piece of work that she did. But her questions are about, I want to collect, I'm impressed by the creativity of this group, I wish to collect it, and I wish to represent it on the page, which is a perfectly noble and well-executed thing. Then you have Carpelise, who is more trained, but agended in an interesting way, because she's carrying on the legacy, no less, of a particularly narrow idea of what comprises folk song and folk song proper. And but influential, and arrives basically with letters of recommendation and reputation ahead of forth. The social networks that she's coming from are just different and more top down. And who does she get in touch with? Well, she gets in touch with influential people in St. John's, influential businessmen, and so on. And so a whole different kind of network that's in place. And without dismissing with the end product, we just want to recognize that the end product is a consequence of a number of different questions and perceptions and aesthetics and expectations and definitions of what comprises what she should and shouldn't be doing. McEdward Leach he came from a university. He was an academic, and he had been an academic basically in balladry. He had sort of discovered the idea of folklore in the early 1930s and became very influential. Well, his work on ballad became very influential, but he was also interested in the possibility of collecting trips. Now, something that Anna doesn't mention in this is that she said, oh, he started becoming interested in Cape Breton, and then he came to Cape Breton in 1949, and then he did 2 trips in Newfoundland in 1950 and 1951. What she doesn't say is that basically his ex-wife, was from Nova Scotia and had property here, and they summered here already. So the Cape Breton trip was sort of bouncing off of that. He was already familiar with Nova Scotia. When he went to Newfoundland, which would have been just after Confederation, so it would have been Canada for literally a couple of months. Yeah, he was in the summer of 49. No, it was 50. It was a year into it. But he was sort of bringing a different agenda. But another thing that he brought with him was he brought a tape recorder. And it was the very first time that people were recording in the field in Cape Breton and in Newfoundland and Labrador. Cape Breton stuff, a lot of songs, some story, most of it, in fact, in Gaelic. There's very little English language. Well, some of the stories are English language, but there's very little English language song that he collected, because he was basically doing the west coast of Cape Breton Island, and he was particularly interested in the Gaelic. And there was an article of that came out in late 1950s, I think, and another one, I can't remember if it was wholly for that or... Anyway, I'm digressing. But he went to Newfoundland in 1950, 1951. He did both the West Coast, which is where Greenleaf and Mansfield did it, and he also did the East Coast in the Avalon Peninsula, which is where Carpelise had done it. He knew these materials. But one of the things that he had the benefit of is he had the benefit of a tape recorder. So he could get a little bit better. It was still like an awkward thing, but he could get a little bit better in terms of capturing these as performances. And it was just on the cusp, just on the cusp of this new technology and how it was shaping how people were understanding folklore and folk texts, and that they could get people to actually perform, and a song might lead to another song, might lead to another song. And so, some of his early recordings, he would turn the recorder off and on and off and on and off and on, and then eventually he learned to leave the recorder on and just keep on going. And the conversations that happened in between, the explanations that happened in between, were just as important. Some of it, the early work, particularly the Cape Breton work, was because he had a finite resource. He didn't have a huge amount of tape to mess around with. He didn't have a huge amount of battery life to mess around with, but he shifted his methodology. Why do I know so much? Well, McEdward Leach didn't do much with the material. He put out a Folkways album in the late 1950s. No, sorry, not until 1965. And that was from the Newfoundland. Yeah, that was from the Newfoundland material. He then went up and did more work in Labrador. He did some Labrador work in the late 1950s and has another book from the National Museum from Ottawa. His sponsored trip. Songs from the Outports? No. Peacock's Songs of the Newfoundland Outports. Can't remember the name of Edward Leach's Labrador book, but again, I will put it here when I edit this together. He didn't do a huge amount with his material. There was one, there's that Kay Breton article I talked about, there's that album, and more or less nothing until the Labrador trip. But then he died in 1967, and he gave all his stuff to Kenneth Goldstein, who was basically his protege at the University of Pennsylvania. Kenneth Goldstein then went up to Newfoundland and was chair of the folklore department there, and he brought all the McEdward Leach stuff and he deposited the McEdward Leach stuff. And so it was at the Memorial University of Newfoundland Folklore and Language Archive since the 1970s. In the early 2000s, Beverly Diamond, who was the recently installed Canada Research Chair in ethnomusicology, one of the first projects that she did through the Music, Media, and Place Research Center that she started was the digitization of McEdward Leach's field recordings and the development of a website to make these accessible. How do I know? I was project manager on that. So I put the whole website together. I was doing HTML with my little fingies, and there'll be links to that in the video description. He was much more, like Greenleaf and Mansfield, he was much more Catholic in his tastes. And he was, he would collect what was being sung, not what people thought should be sung. So from him, even though his work and Peacock's didn't really coincide until much later, Peacock wouldn't have known of Leach's work or wouldn't have had access to Leach's work at the time he went. That was sort of the three different modes. You had the amateur, the nationalist, and the academic. You had different perceptions about what should and shouldn't be collected, and you had different questions about how the material would be dispersed. And then you had the national context, because what do Greenleaf, Karpeles, and Leach all have in common? None of them are Canadian. None of them are being sponsored by Canadians. None of them are being sponsored by Canadian institutions. They're being welcomed by Canadians. And I should sort of extend that. Neither of them, they weren't Canadian. They weren't from Newfoundland, because it wasn't until 1949 that we can effectively say that Newfoundlanders were Canadian. So they were from away. They had this outsider perspective, this very outsider perspective in terms of being, nations away, and they had different academic questions. Then you had the National Museum in Ottawa. The National Museum, particularly thanks to Marius Barbeau, who was a student of Franz Boas, had a fledgling interest in folk song. Barbeau collected, he was both how to phrase this succinctly. Barbeau, because of his training, was interested in folklore in general, the traditional songs and patterns and habits of Canadian peoples. The National Museum had more or less, and his colleagues more or less had the idea that what ethnology proper is, or what anthropology proper is in the Canadian perspective, is First Nation stuff. And it's not that that is a poor project, but that is a limiting project. So they didn't support his work in what was primarily French-Canadian folk song. There was a popular demand for this because Canadians were as metropolitan as the Americans, and the same kind of interest in Canadian traditional stuff was emerging in Canada in the same way that the interest in American traditional stuff was emerging in America. And so there was this public idea, but it was somehow the museum didn't think it proper. And the museum was underfunded in general, and Canadian arts and culture had been historically underfunded, especially after the Depression, especially during the war. I mean, if you can even if we push back against it, we can sympathize with what happens when you have the finite resources of a national budget, and you have to start seeing what are you going to support and what you aren't going to support. So, but it's one of those things where they had a museum that they had a museum because they thought they had to have a museum, and then they didn't fund it properly. It's the same reason that they think that they need universities and they don't fund universities properly. It's the same, or that we need national broadcaster, but then we're not going to fund it properly. So they have it for the sake of having it. I'm being a bit disparaging, but therefore that's one of the reasons why Barbeau, his work wasn't supported, is that we only have a limited amount of money, and we all think that we should be focusing on First Nation stuff. Cool. And someone who knows that stuff better can critique the National Museum and the relationship that they had to the First Nations. That is, I'm imagining, all sorts of problematic, but that's not my discussion for today. Barbeau is interested in stuff, and he's interested in folk stuff as well as, and it kind of was moldering and sitting around and not doing much of anything. And he was in the late 1940s. He was getting to be towards retirement age, and he had tons and tons of this material on wax cylinders because he'd been collecting for that long that they were still doing on the old sort of Edison type cylinders. And it was more or less at risk of going to waste. And then a music student was interested in primitive music, or whatever it was called at those days, Margaret Sargent. And she was interested in basically folk song, which was peculiar because academics weren't interested in it. Schools of music weren't supporting it, but they directed her advisors directed her towards Barbeau, and Barbeau was like, yeah, have your, feel your boots, and was actually kind of invigorated by the idea that someone else was interested in this stuff. She produced a dissertation, they kept up a correspondence, and he started to sort of reinvigorate this idea. Helen Crichton became a part of his crew. Slowly he was able to get through, jump through hoops, and he was able to get a little bit of sort of a, department of folklore within the museum. Still very small, and it's one of the things that sort of caused this rift, if not necessarily political rift, but at least sort of a intellectual distinction between folklore and ethnology, in that ethnology is properly focused on First Nations, and then folklore is sort of like everything else, or every other people's, or whatever. The tension between folklore and ethnology as approaches, and the tension between them as names, could fill another video. So I'm not going to, in Canada, can fill another video. So I'm not going to talk about that too much. But anyway, so folklore is kind of this strange stepchild of the larger project of the National Museum. But it started to have a bit of an incentive, and Sargent came across Carpelli's book and said, maybe Newfoundland. And she came across it when she got when Barbeau came back and hired her in 1948, 1949, and said, we should perhaps think about Newfoundland, especially since Newfoundland had just entered Canada, and there's nothing in the museum representing Newfoundland because it hadn't been part of Canada except for like the past couple of weeks. And so, 1950, she makes this trip and starts a little bit of collecting, nothing systemic, and then that sets the stage for Peacock coming. Kenneth Peacock, who was a Toronto-based student and had a music pedigree, and he did some trips in 1951 and 1952, and that's, and he kept on going back to Newfoundland, but basically that is what spawned, at the very least, his very first publication, 9 Songs from Newfoundland. And 9 Songs from Newfoundland is Journal of American Folklore, 1954. And what's interesting about it is that unlike previous publications about Atlantic Canada, and of course this is one of the very first times when Newfoundland was being included in that conversation of Atlantic Canada, because it was one of the first times when, again, Newfoundland was Canada. So all of a sudden this area was being reframed, and we still distinguish the Maritimes from Newfoundland, but now we think of, when we think of Eastern Canada, we think of the 4 provinces. And this is, of course, well before 1999, when Newfoundland's name changed to Newfoundland and Labrador as it is today. So all of a sudden, you have this shift. Well, sorry, not all of a sudden, but in terms of if you were to just condense the bibliography of Atlantic Canadian folklore in a journal such as Journal of American Folklore, you start to see how these things have changed in their presentation. And that now he is focusing not simply on like collecting all the stuff of a community. He's like, I'm focusing on song. Song is what I am doing. I have a lot of representations, and I'll let you know that there are other things. This is not representative of an entire repertoire. These are just a few. He introduces things. He introduces the tellers. He talks about their musicality as seriously as he talks about their words. He puts all these words, you can see at the end, where for each song, he discusses them as pieces of music. So here it is, the Bonny Young Irish Boy. It's in the mode of D, Dorian, a tonic D. A la bien-aimée absente would be a fitting title for this Irish song, consisting of 3 melodic phrases, the first uttered only once, the second repeated with a slight variation in development, pausing on the 5th note and going back to the first phrase, which now becomes the 3rd and concludes on the tonic. Of this song, as of Napoleon's Farewell, which is a song that he had already discussed, it can be said that it uses only 6 notes of the scale, as it touches only once in a passing ornament to the 6th note characteristic of the mode, yet there seems to be enough to place the melody in the Dorian mode. The melodic profile is very typical, as in the other songs, of a great beauty. So he's editorializing a little bit in terms of a great beauty, but just as importantly, he's taking them seriously as musical traditions and not just simply these lyric traditions. He recognizes that this is stuff that can get reused over time, that older forms can come back. And so we can think of them as, think of the melodies as traditional texts, as much as the lyrics as traditional texts, and recognizes that there is both, that there is a musical ear, a musical intelligence that goes into singing them, in addition to the intellectual ear, I guess, that goes into reciting them, and composing them anew as well. And so he's marrying these two together, and which is a revelation as far as he was concerned. There's a wonderful bit on page 124. Again, allow me to read. After preliminary apologies for the hoarseness of his voice caused by a bad cold, often miraculously cured by only 1 drink, the singer clears his throat and begins. 9 out of 10 times he will rest one elbow on the table or the end of the sofa and tap his fingers on his temple in time with the music. As the song progresses, he loses all personal contact with his audience and fixes his gaze on some vacancy far beyond the confines of the kitchen. Perhaps this is partly responsible for the widespread belief that some folk singers sing in an offhand, monotonous manner completely devoid of expression. It's true the singing is not expressive in our sense of the world, that is, personally expressive. The folk singer doesn't express himself, but something else. Just as the Indian singer actually becomes the spirit when he dons the mask, so the singer in this case enters a larger world and becomes an instrument of communication, not merely the center of attention. In this respect, then, the singing is expressive. Key words in the text are often emphasized by pauses or by ornate figurations. Much of the trouble involved in transcription was caused by the singer's admirable but annoying habit of singing the figurations a different way each time he was asked to repeat a verse. Sometimes the songs were sung so freely that it was impossible to add time signatures or bar lines until further study of the text and melody revealed the basic form. The grace notes do not interrupt the flow of the music, but sound like melodic kinks in the voice. The overall effect is broad, complex, subtle, and thrilling. If there is such a thing in folk singing as the grand manner, then I am sure this closely approaches it. He is celebrating the artistry and the context of the musicianship of the singers. Note how absent the performer is prior to this. So much of the stuff that got published, and therefore the stuff that we have left of the study of folklore in Atlantic Canada, is devoid of this kind of description. And unfortunately, Peacock in his later work didn't talk this way too often either. He was much more interested in the text, and he kind of lost that descriptive. But we have this one little nugget where all of a sudden we have this idea that we don't need to be precious and only seek that which strikes us, the outsider, as authentic because it strikes us as old, and subsequently we close our ears to what is new because it strikes us as therefore inauthentic. But we take the person as, he romanticizes it, talks about that sort of, falling into the spirit, almost sort of capturing it. But the fact that it's romanticized doesn't necessarily mean that it isn't an interesting idea to pursue and to at least pause on. That what we witness when we witness folk performance is this blend of artistry and individuality and creativity with at least this sense of continuity, of being a conduit, of being a inheritor, and just a temporary caretaker of the creativity of the past. Both of those are in play. And Peacock is, in some ways, an inheritor of the tradition of folk song scholarship in Newfoundland that went before. And in the same way, builds upon it with his own creativity and his own questions and his own more holistic view, at least for this article. So I don't have much else to say at this point. These are good to read in concert with each other. Because Peacock's, you could read, I recommend all of Anna's book, and I recommend all of Peacock as a collection. But, again, it's a collection, so it's a lot of text, a lot of notes, and not necessarily thick description. But Anna puts, I think this one chapter segues into this first presentation of results from Kenneth Peacock well. And it really helps in understanding this trajectory in how not simply things were created, and not simply how things were researched, but how the final products came to be based on the questions. So when we lift up things like the final endpoints, the final books that enter into the academic discourse, but also enter into the popular discourse and start to warp around the folk tradition and influence the folk tradition and start to say, well, this was representative of this time, therefore anything that falls outside, question marks. It's good to remember that these are historical documents by noble and simultaneously fallible human beings. Yeah, I think that's about all I want to say. So, my very good friends, as ever, I'm your best bud. We have been talking about Anna Guigné's Folksong Collections and Folklore Research in Newfoundland, 1920 to 1950, and Kenneth Peacock's 9 Songs from Newfoundland. I wish you absolutely nothing but the best. Be well. Bye-bye.